Hi, I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington Realtors legal hotline lawyer. And in this video today, we're talking about paragraph 3 of the Financing Contingency Form 22A. And this discussion necessarily feeds off of the discussion that we had about paragraph 2 in the last video. So if you haven't seen the paragraph 2 video, please go back and watch that before you watch this video. The importance of that discussion, though, that I want to bring forward to this video is a reminder that the financing contingency is a document put into the transaction by buyer. It's buyer's request of seller for seller to take seller's property off the market while buyer goes to figure out whether or not they can get financing. Before we go any further, I want to ask you a question. If this transaction fails to close at the closing table, will there be loss suffered? And the answer absolutely and undeniably has to be yes. Buyer is going to lose, at a minimum, their appraisal fee, their inspection fee, maybe their earnest money. Seller is going to lose all of that marketing time. And when they put the house back on the market, if the price hasn't gone down, then they are still putting the house back on the market. And anybody who knows anything about this industry knows there is a stigma attached to any property that goes back on the market. And some explanation is required as to why that first sale failed. So yes, there will be loss suffered. The question that the financing contingency presents is who, between buyer and seller, is going to carry the burden of that loss. And when buyer makes an offer that includes a financing contingency in the offer, buyer says to seller, "Seller, will you please carry the burden on your shoulders, seller, carry the burden for whether or not I will get financing." Recognizing that I, as the buyer, am entirely and 100% in control of identifying the lender, making timely loan application, getting my documents submitted timely, instructing my lender to order the appraisal. In other words, everything required to get timely loan approval is in my sole and exclusive jurisdiction as buyer. But seller, my request of you is that you carry the burden of loss related to my inability or failure to get financing. That's what the financing contingency says. And if you don't pay attention to paragraph 3, then that's all that the financing contingency says, because based on its own terms, the financing contingency never, ever, ever, ever expires. That's why paragraph 3 becomes important. And I want you to remember before we even talk about paragraph 3, that buyer is the party that injects the financing contingency into the transaction. Buyer is the one who wants Form 22A in this transaction. So when buyer puts Form 22A into the transaction, buyer also puts paragraph 3 of Form 22A into the transaction. What does paragraph 3 say? Paragraph 3, similar to paragraph 2, says, "Seller, I am so earnest in my effort, my good faith effort to get this loan, that I am asking you to test me as to my good faith. Here's the test, seller, I'm asking you to give me. 30 days after mutual acceptance, or whatever number of days the parties put in that blank. The fewer number of days works to seller's advantage, the larger the number of days works to buyer's advantage. It's 30 days by default, so let's just use 30 days for the purposes of our discussion. Buyer says to seller, 30 days after the date of mutual acceptance, seller, I invite you to give to me a notice of right to terminate. And when I get that notice of right to terminate, within 3 days, I will do one of only two things. I will either waive my financing contingency or I'll do nothing at all. Under no circumstances, seller, will I have the right to terminate the transaction because you gave me a notice of right to terminate. Buyer never has the opportunity to terminate the transaction because seller delivers the notice of right to terminate. Instead, buyer's only option is to waive the financing contingency. Now, listing brokers, I want you to ask yourselves a question. If buyer waives the financing contingency, is seller in a better position than they were before they delivered the notice of right to terminate? The answer is yes, because buyer is now moving towards closing with no financing contingency. If buyer is unable to close a transaction, buyer will be in default, seller will get to keep the earnest money. If buyer does nothing at all, the effect of that is that seller now has the unilateral right to terminate the transaction if seller chooses to do so. Seller is under no obligation to terminate the transaction, but if seller wants to terminate the transaction, seller can do so. So if seller has a better buyer in backup position, seller can terminate the transaction like that. If buyer fails to waive their financing contingency within 3 days of receiving the seller's notice of right to terminate, Form 22AR. Seller may not have a backup buyer. But if seller attracts another buyer, or if listing broker is simply following up with the buyer's lender and finds out, for example, that buyer's appraisal came in low, but buyer chose not to deliver the notice of low appraisal, which buyer has the right to choose not to do. Stay tuned for a subsequent episode in this series. Listing broker may be able to advise seller, look, seller, it's unlikely this buyer is going to get this financing, get their financing. They've still got another 20 days prior to closing. You may want to terminate this transaction now so you can get it back on the market. Since buyer's not willing to waive their financing contingency, buyer must have reason to believe that there's a good chance they're not going to get their financing. So if buyer's not willing to take the risk off of seller's shoulders after 30 days, why should seller continue to carry that risk going forward? Now, it may be that seller evaluates all the circumstances and says, you know what, I don't have a better option right now. I'd rather stick it out with this buyer and see if they can get across the closing line. Maybe that's what seller says. But once seller delivers that 22AR and buyer doesn't waive their financing contingency, seller is still in a better position than they were before they delivered the 22AR because now they are in the driver's seat. And if the opportunity comes where seller says, I need to jump, I want out of this transaction, seller has the unilateral right to terminate the transaction and go somewhere else. Only, however, if they have delivered the notice of right to terminate. Okay, there's a ton of information already in this video, but believe it or not, I have even more to say on this topic. So we're going to go to the next video next Friday to finish this discussion. Please come back. Until then, if you have questions, send an email to me, legalhotline@warealtor.org. Thank you for being a Washington Realtors member.